ELL students. First, we're going to start in the early 19th century, looking specifically at the dates of 1836 to 1848. In 1836, there was shown evidence from blatant documents that the history of bilingual education in Texas began as early as 1836. Then we move on to 1848, to the states of what is now New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, created a law that called for Spanish-English bilingual programs. This was a big step considering that it was in the early 19th century. This is significant because it shows that there was some concern in the United States early in the 19th century when it comes to bilingual education for ELL students. They were making an effort to establish it during this time. Next, we're going to look at Brown versus Board of Education, which occurred in 1954. This is the case that the Supreme Court rules out separate but equal in schools. However, this was seen as an unconstitutional and a violation of the 14th Amendment to have segregation in schools. Within a year, all schools were ordered to desegregate schools with deliberate speed. This was seen as a big step for English language learners in the education system, as they were no longer seen as different, but seen as equal. This could be seen as one of the first steps to implicate a changing education system in a positive direction for ELL students. Next, we're going to look at the Civil Rights Act, Title VI, 1964. This was a law that passed the obliged school districts to act in terms of bilingual education. For example, they must provide sufficiently well-prepared staff and trained staff and support language assistant programs for ELL students. There were no issues, however, when it comes to bilingual education when this law was passed. For example, there was seen to be an educational neglect of Mexican American students that was documented by Tescon in 1965 to 1966. Nonetheless, this was seen as an important improvement towards ELL students in the classrooms, as there was direct procedures for school districts to follow when it came to the education of them. Next, we're going to look at Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which could also be called the ESEA, which occurred in 1965. Wright wrote on page 74, before 1968, there were no federal education language policies for ELLs. There were often places in regular, often segregated classrooms where they were left to sink or swim. This was seen as no way for students to be treated in the classroom as they are learning as well. The ESEA was a law that Congress passed that included key components such as funds, policies, and procedure target students from low-income families, which is also from page 74 from Wright. This law helped improve and implicate help for ELL students because they were funded help from the government to improve procedures for those students who were behind in school and to improve their accuracy and function in school. Now we're going to look at the Bilingual Education Act, which is Title VII of Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It became a law in 1968. The goal here was to encourage schools to incorporate bilingual education. This law passed and provided grants to school districts and other eligible entities through a competitive grant process. Thus, most regulations associated with the Title VII applied only to funded programs. However, if you were a funded program, the funds could be used for program development and research, staff training, and educational resources. This was another way that ELL students' education could be improved in the United States. With the help of this funded program, students would feel more included and staff would be better equipped to help those students succeed. Next, we're going to look at Serena versus Portales, which occurred in 1974. This case is extremely important because it actually marks one of the first cases to argue that schools uphold a right to bilingual education for Mexican American children. This was an important step for bilingual education in classrooms because before, with just the Bilingual Education Act, the lines were blurry of exactly what the solution was for ELL students, as there was no set curriculum for those students. This would be monumental for school districts and ELL students to ensure that they are receiving the education they were told they would when the school was funded under the Bilingual Education Act. Next, we're going to look at Equal Educational Opportunities Act in 1974. This act was passed by Congress, and it states that public schools must provide additional language support to limited English proficient students so that they can have a more meaningful educational experience. This was yet another reauthorization of the ESEA in 1974 to continue to modify how bilingual education would be in the classroom. This was an important step for ELL students as well. They would understand that Congress is looking out for them and that they are valued in the school system and that their education is seen as just as important as native English speakers. Now we're going to look at the Bilingual Educational Act, which was reauthorized for the final time in 1994. So while it seemed that each time the BEA was reauthorized, there was not many specifics when it came to how the structure would be in the classroom to develop ELL students, this specific reauthorization did just that. This would set the stage for bilingual students to receive an education that would help districts obtain grants from a federal level with a structure that would help them begin in a school setting and benefit from the education they're receiving. This was a huge deal as the Bilingual Educational Act was reauthorized many times. However, as I stated, this was seen as the final time in 1994 before big changes would be soon made. Next, we're going to look at the No Child Left Behind. This occurred from 2002 to 2017, and this was created under President George W. Bush. Initially, when the law was first passed, ELL students were required to take state tests regardless of their English proficiency or how long they had been in the country. As Wright states on page 75, there is a heavy emphasis on accountability through high-stakes testing in English, language arts, reading, and mathematics in grades 3 to 8, and once in high school. Science exams were also required 3 times between grades 3 and 12. ELLs were also required to take state tests regardless of their English proficiency. Some more requirements of this was that each state was required to create academic content standards and assessments to measure whose standards and use those results to hold schools accountable. This system was flawed because it seemed to pose an improper expectation on ELL students in the classroom, as well as students who were behind in their schooling because it was seen as being taught to the test, which would be hard for ELL students who are still struggling to enter this country and find their way through the United States education system. However, this could be seen as a motivation for ELL students because they were more integrated in the classroom. There should have been regulations on the time that schools were able to obtain the best test results possible instead of just moving on with ELL students and others before they seemed ready. It did impact our education system greatly, but we're still unsure if any student was left behind or if they were not. Next, we're going to look at Every Student Succeeds, which is 2015 to present time. This was created under President Barack Obama, and it affords states much greater flexibility in establishing school accountability programs. This seems to be the current best practice in place for ELL students. This has seemed to improve the overall practice for ELL students that was under the No Child Left Behind Act before. For example, affords states an opportunity to establish more flexible and reasonable expectations for ELLs and other students in their schools. However, with this act being so new, we haven't yet seen any exact effects that it will have on students currently. Nonetheless, it does seem to have provided a better environment for ELLs in their placement in schools. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned a little bit more about ELL education.